Thanks everyone for joining today. It's great to have a panelist here to talk through healthcare and technology and security. And so before we get started on our panel, I'd like to just take a minute and talk through who we have on our panel today. Just kind of do some quick introductions, and then we'll get started on the topic. So my name is Tim Chase. I'm a field CISO at Lacework. Been a CISO a couple of times. Ran several cloud security practices and had experience in several different places in the healthcare industry in my background. And then we'll just kind of pass it on over to Connor on down the line to give you a brief intro of yourself.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, my name is Connor Colgan. I'm a senior solutions architect with the AWS Healthcare Startups organization. So I work primarily with healthcare startups, and I have an area of expertise in compliance and security. So for the last few years, working on that here at AWS, and prior to that, I helped build automation that helped enforce HIPAA and GDPR and GXP compliance on the cloud. It's nice to be here.
Awesome, great.
Alrighty, I think I'm next. Good afternoon, morning, everyone. My name is Pulay Patel. I'm a solutions engineer as a current role with our GRC and Security Assurance Cloud at Tugboat Logic and OneTrust. My past experience with healthcare is managing patient safety and incident management with various different healthcare organizations. I worked in that space for a little over 7 years. So happy to bringing my experience into the conversation today, and thank you for having me.
Fantastic.
And Kevin Odell. I'm CTO for Defiance Digital. So we are a cloud MSP that does everything from cloud operations to managed security. We partner closely with Lacework on that. And my background has everything from infrastructure, DevOps side to big data analytics.
Awesome. So it sounds like you've got people you guys are from healthcare, but you're maybe coming at it from different aspects, from cloud background, patient care, compliance background, SOC. So I think we'll have a pretty good discussion. We can all come at these questions from a little bit of a different perspective. So I think the kind of an open-ended question that I'll toss out to you guys, every industry, I would say, has some unique challenges that they're trying to solve in security today, right? Anywhere from, the financial sector kind of maybe has their own. Some of the utility companies have their own security issues that they're concerned with. But what do you guys see in the healthcare field? What do you see as some of the biggest challenges that the healthcare industry is facing?
Yeah, I can start. So I'll kind of start with the picture I see from startups. That's tend to be who I work with the most. And when I talk to healthcare startups, their biggest challenges right now are trying to understand the security compliance landscape. It's how do I know that I'm following the right rules? How do I implement the right security controls? In a fast-moving technology world. So a lot of these startups are cloud native. So they're looking at ways and what services do I need in place? A lot of them tend to still think in the legacy on-premises world, things like endpoint protection, network segmentation, and a lot of these are not the right solution for cloud native technologies. So a lot of it is a learning experience. It's trying to figure out or get past the I don't know what I don't know phase. That's probably the biggest one I see coming out of startups. And when I talk to established organizations, a lot of them are trying to figure out how they could take advantage of some of these new technologies. A lot of them, especially in the provider world, tend to be pretty slow and lag behind adoption of new technology. So they're trying to figure out ways how can they implement these things, with limited budget, limited resources.
Okay. Why do you think that compliance is I think that's an interesting thing to think about, because different companies maybe think about, nation threats and things like that. Why do you think compliance is the hardest thing for some of these health techs to get their handle on?
Yeah. So especially in the startup world, when you tend to be starting, you're coming from it from generally one of two sides. You're either experienced in the healthcare space and you're probably newer to cloud, or conversely, you're familiar with the technology, but you're not very familiar in the healthcare space. You have an idea and you have a market fit, but that doesn't necessarily mean you understand the compliance landscape. And healthcare compliance is complicated. In the US, we have HIPAA, but that may be an established regulation, but it's not easy to implement. The controls are what's known as interpretive. They're kind of vague rules that you have to figure out which ones apply, and then how do you meet them. And then beyond that, there's state regulations. There's if you're ever going to touch a European citizen data, you have to comply with GDPR. So it's a complex landscape, and it's hard to get started. So generally, in that case, what we recommend is engaging with professionals who do this all the time. They do not necessarily an audit, but they can do like risk assessments. So they can come in and look at what controls do you need, and and how should you implement them. So it really starts training them. So that helps the people that are more maybe cloud native and are coming from the technology side. And then you have folks on the healthcare side who don't understand the technology. So they have this in their head. They understand what they need to do. They know they need to encrypt data. They know they need to back up the data, but they don't know how to do that use the cloud effectively, using things like infrastructure as code and automation to help actually enforce compliance. So it's a lot of learning just to get there, but that's kind of what I've seen with the compliance side.
Yeah, and I'll dovetail off of what Connor was saying. Is one of the bigger challenges, I think, is that the healthcare space had a pretty big exodus going into the pandemic. And so they're struggling with a little bit of, I don't want to say talent acquisition / retention, but Presidio did a survey earlier this year. And for me, one of the shocking numbers that came back from the healthcare execs, less than 23% of them say that their team is currently proficient in DevOps and automation. And when you start getting into, I mean, honestly, you should do it on-prem land as well, but like cloud world, is that automation is something you'll probably hear me harp on a bunch here, and it makes your compliance life easier. It makes your deployment life easier, right? Being able to build everything into a pipeline that self-checks, and you're not always running around worrying about people manually provisioning S3 resources on their own. And did they leave something public or did they not leave something public? Like that's something that you don't have to worry about in the on-prem space. Is my file storage is never going to accidentally end up on the internet. Well, I shouldn't say never. People can do some interesting things, right? But in the cloud world, it's a click of a bucket to turn your object store into something public. So do you have automation around config management? Do you control the way everything is deployed in a very specific way? And if you're not proficient on that side, everything just gets harder.
Yep. Go ahead. Yeah, just one thing to add on the challenges as well. I think where center of all of this is the data that we're collecting. So as the organizations are growing, the amount of data that they're collecting and managing and understanding where all this data lives amongst their IT infrastructure, their business associates they work with, who's transmitting this patient health data. So understanding all of that has become a bigger challenge when you're moving into kind of the compliance world, right? Understanding exactly where my assets are, what sort of data is housed in there, how are we safeguarding it, and if we're transmitting this data to a third party, what are the safeguards they're taking in place? So it's just managing that full compliance network, and as the organization grows, it's just getting a little bit more complex with all that data collection.
And that makes sense.
One thing I'll add.
Go ahead.
Or one thing to add on the data that's also, I think, really important is not only securing the data, but it's thinking about the privacy of the data too, and controlling who has access to it. So to your point about data as it scales out, it's it becomes everywhere. You have to make sure you know where it is, what it is, and who has access to it. And that is not only it is a challenge, but there are controls in the cloud. To what Kevin said about using automation, I'm probably going to harp on that all day too. You can use automation and cloud controls and all these things that at scale. It's designed to work at scale, so you can implement these privacy controls as your data grows. So you reduce your risk of a potential, opening up permissions too much, for example.
No, that makes sense. I heard a couple of things I'd like to dig a little bit deeper in. And one was kind of this data thing, right? Then I want to come back to the auditor thing, because I think, Connor, I think you mentioned, auditing is a little bit of a challenge in the cloud. But, obviously, one of the challenges whenever someone goes from on-prem to the cloud is there seems to be a lot more data, whether that's because of of all the data that you're moving to the cloud, combination of all the data that you can access in the cloud, like in the form of logs. There seems to be a lot more, information there that you have to deal with. Like from a healthcare company, how do you guys have any advice on how you would go about securing that data? I know we talked a little bit about, I think, automation, and maybe we could talk a little bit more about that. But I think one of the big challenges is the fact that you're going to be putting a lot of your data out there in some place that you don't directly control. So, do you have any thoughts on how you would go about securing it, or where they would even start?
That is a really fun question. And again, I think a lot of that comes back to a little bit of the skill set stuff that we're talking about for the reskilling your team to be cloud ready. The private data centers, I think, have lulled teams into being a little more complacent in the way that they have to think about security, because it's private. You've got your bay of firewalls. I think the only things that are going to come in are the stuff that you want. Where, looking at something like AWS, it's a giant state machine of interwoven services. And those interwoven services, if taken advantage of, which I always recommend people try not to stay cloud agnostic so they can drop their AWS app over into Azure, but embrace the cloud native portions of technologies, is though you do have a far more readily available attack surface, for lack of a better phrasing, where you can start saying like, all right, I'm going to spin up all my API gateways. I'm going to back that with my serverless technology. I'm then going to use things like Glue to go ahead and start doing ETL work, right? Like when you start having all these different intertwined services, you have to know how you want to configure those. You have to look at them, right? And that again comes back to, I think a lot of that is the misconfiguration and the exploitation of serverless and arguably of container workloads. And again, I go back to the automation and the DevOps piece of there has to be a really tight partnership there. You have to work with your dev teams to say, look, I know for your containers, you want to pin these certain package versions so that you don't have to do full regression testing because we're a startup and we just haven't built those tests out yet. But the next thing you know, you find yourself dropping containers that are 3 or 4 revisions, major revisions behind what the latest that's coming off of Docker Hub, as an example, are. And if you're not using something like Lacework, as an example, to do vulnerability scanning across them, you may not realize how many critical vulnerabilities you're introducing into the wild. You can pick your Lambda versions. You may not know how far back you are from the latest Lambda version because you pin that on Python 3.6 or whatever version that you're on, right? And so you have to be able to be flexible, take the time to check that, to test that, and to have your dev team work with your DevOps team to make sure that you are staying on good security posture, patching those, keeping things on latest, understanding what's happening, having process around how do you handle criticals, highs, all of that that's going to occur inside of there. Infrastructure as code is something Connor mentioned earlier, right? Someone says, hey, I need a new S3 bucket. Okay, we will deploy that for you based on the guidelines that you need because we already have those proper configurations mapped out. Getting away from as much like how do you eliminate the human error inside of that? And if you do that really well, you also then allow your application developers to focus on the application development and pushing the business forward. And you don't have to spend as many cycles trying to make sure that you're running around playing whack-a-mole all the time.
So that goes to another question that I had for later on, but just kind of leading off that, do you guys think that when these healthcare companies, when they start going to the cloud, we talked about lift and shift being a no-no, but do you think it's important for them to make a DevOps transformation at the same time that they're going to the cloud? Like, do you think that from a security perspective, going DevOps will help them when they go to the cloud? Like, do you think you have to do them both at the same time? What do you got? What have you guys seen, or what are your thoughts?
I'm a big DevOps advocate, so I'm obviously going to say yes. I think you should really consider what is your DevOps, and really, like, however you want to call it, DevSecOps, DevOps security, however you want to call that side. How do those intertwine, and how are you going to handle these cloud workloads? And look, there's nothing wrong with doing a lift and shift to get into the cloud, get your application set up, get familiar with the controls, and then start to do application decoupling or modernization, whatever AWS buzzword you want to use on that is, right? That's fine. And then to step into that, there is that concept of boiling the ocean and trying to change your DevOps posture, change your security posture, decouple an application, learn how to use microservices, move to a containerized environment. You'll probably set yourself up for failure by trying to do that all at once. But you still need to be, like, I would say that the DevSecOps side is paramount to the success, so you can feel comfortable on that decision.
So I use the metaphor of building a house, and building the foundation first. So think about building your security controls, and I agree with Kevin, using the DevOps model of align your controls as early as possible into these workloads will set you up better for success long term. If you don't have a strong foundation, if you're not partnering between security and development, if there's not a strong understanding of why something needs to be a certain way between those two organizations, you're gonna run into problems later on. But if you can I'm going to use a cliche here, but if you can shift left with security and do it earlier, it's going to set you up better for success. And then thinking to that, you can start that in the lift and shift. You can build your foundation, then you can drop your existing workloads onto that foundation, and then you can build up from there. But because you have that strong foundation of security, a strong partnership between development, operations, and security, whether you want to call it DevSecOps or they're completely separate organizations, but if they can work together to build that foundation, I've seen much greater success in the long run with customers who start earlier and build that out. And I've seen problems where they don't. They fight later, and it delays deployments, it delays feature releases, and it can cause significant problems.
Yep. And just to add on to that, right, building that foundation is key, but taking that maturity level up to kind of the risk management focus, understanding, what sort of risks a certain change. I'm not as technical as these guys, to be honest, but understanding what sort of development changes will allow them to manage any ongoing risk, or tracking their risk appetite for an organization over time. So that's how the maturity of having that strong foundation can help them build from a more of a security and compliance approach to more of a risk approach, and going back to Connor's earlier point of having that risk analysis on a periodic basis, assessing that, how much risk can we take as an organization before things start to fall.
Okay. That's interesting. So I'm going to pivot a little bit based on your last statement, how much risk. Do you guys, we've talked a little bit about health tech, I think, but do you guys see that healthcare in general, are they making the shift to the cloud? You could put, that could be, hospitals, healthcare providers, EMRs, anything like that. Are they making the shift to the cloud in the same way that a lot of these, these startup health tech companies are? Obviously, a lot of these health tech, fintech, those type of people are kind of born in the cloud. But do you see the traditional sort of maybe old school healthcare companies? Do you see them making the same move to the cloud at the same speed?
Not at the same speed, certainly.
Yeah.
But it continues to grow. I mean, year over year, cloud adoption in healthcare market is in the double digits. I don't remember the exact number. And if I look at, if you split it up, we've covered health tech pretty significantly already. But if I think of the other two major categories, like a payer or a provider, I've seen a lot of payers with quicker cloud adoption and more modern DevOps adoption. But these are organizations that have more significant budgets. They can build things in-house. They're motivated a little differently through things like interoperability and some of the requirements around that. So that did push a lot. So I see a lot of adoption in the payer side. The payer side. On the provider side, they're still quite slow. I do see adoption, especially in larger enterprise provider organizations. But for others, like a small network of say clinics, the closest thing they're getting to cloud adoption is maybe a web-based EMR, but they're not hosting anything. These are buyers; they're not builders, but they're buying SaaS solutions out of the cloud,
which are big steps, right? I mean, that's kind of the first step is accepting that other people are capable of running cloud applications, but then you're beholden to their security standards. So I always recommend to people, like, ask the questions that other people are asking you about how do you secure and protect the data that you're going to give them.
Why do you think that
having a server in the closet?
That's true. Still is better than having a server in the closet. Why do you think that is? Do you think it's just because it's a risk that they're not ready to take on? Is it because it's hard? Maybe it's like trying to push a rock up a hill with some of these larger ones, or do you think it's a skill set problem?
I'm not sure.
Skill set.
I'm not willing to put a point.
It's a lot.
One.
It's a lot. I think it's a lot of things.
Providers are they're resource constrained. These are people running on very thin margins. They're running, especially in the pandemic, they are behind the eight ball and have been for years. They were before the pandemic, and now it's worse. So that's a big factor. I've met with enterprise hospital organizations who have some of the strongest technologists I've ever met. And they're starting cloud adoption, but they need to keep the lights on. They need to keep the clinics running. They need to keep the systems that keep people alive. That's what they're focused on. And that's why they're not going to tend to build their own in-house applications. They're buyers. And I think that's still the biggest factor. I think the risk for cloud the risk appetite is increasing. So I think they're getting more and more comfortable with the cloud, certainly. But cloud adoption for things that they run on premise I think it's still a ways off, just because of those resource constraints.
Yeah. I'll throw something out there and you guys tell me if you agree or disagree. But one of the things, as I've talked to some of these larger healthcare organizations, that I found is that they all have like these, a lot of them have cloud transformation projects. That's kind of this big thing, right? And that seems to be difficult because I think that sometimes maybe the larger ones haven't figured out how to go from on-prem to the cloud and do it in an efficient way, whether that's a cost-efficient way, resource-efficient way. And security is just one factor of that, right? It's how do you secure something of that scale? It's just one part of the cloud, the overall cloud migration effort that I see. I don't know if you guys disagree or if you see that a lot, but that's one of the things that the transformation thing just seems to be hard. Like the people who are born and bred and maybe they understand the cloud better is one thing, but there's more of a transformation that has to happen for some of these larger organizations, so to speak.
It is, though. It's hard, right? I mean, you are talking about people that have built their careers around this is the right way to do things on premise. I have my hardware, I deploy my hardware, here's how my application's secured. And then when you talk about going up to this other paradigm, there's a lot of things that feel like they'd be intuitive that you would want to do from the data center, but they're not best practices from the cloud side. And then you start to get into, again, you go back to the concept I mentioned earlier of like serverless, right? Like a lot of these companies, as Connor pointed out, they're just now starting to dabble in the concept of containers. I mean, one of Red Hat's top selling products still is OpenShift, and a lot of people are still trying to figure that out on-prem. And then you start talking about trying to come up into the cloud, and we're going to run this ECS thing, and we're going to start doing these containers. But okay, so Lambdas are serverless, but I still need to do my state. So do I want state machine? Right? Like part of the cloud's promise is like you can do anything, you can do it at scale, and it's really fun to do all of that. But there's also a whole daunting thing of, oh, by the way, here's a list of 500 services we have. Make sure you pick the right one, or you're going to have a bad time. So you throw that like old tribal knowledge into this whole new paradigm, new way of doing things on top of a completely different way of securing it and becoming compliant, right? And there's skill problems, there's barrier to entry problems, there's data gravity problems for the data is already being generated inside the providers. How do I want to move that data up, right? There's just it's easy to pick on them and say like, you guys are slow and you should get it together and move faster. But also on that side of the house, it's very, very daunting. Like I would much rather Bank of America lose my financial records in a breach than all of my health records, right? Like I appreciate the care that they're taking on that side, and I can internalize why that's so much harder on this side of the house.
Agree. What do you? I'll have another question, then we'll shift it over to maybe some more compliance stuff. But what do you think that we as security practitioners can do? Like, we're obviously in all different areas of security. As security practitioners, when we go in and we talk, like, are there things that we can do to make this transformation easier to these HealthTech customers? Or, if you were there, how would you approach security for for these healthcare companies?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of our responsibility, I think, as security technologists, is to help guide these customers, right? So, like Kevin said, AWS has hundreds of services, dozens and dozens could be considered security and compliance. And how do you choose the right one? Let alone how do you build something with them that's meaningful? And that's where, like myself, like a solutions architect or a partner or an SI is going to come in, and they should be providing that guidance and teaching them. So it's a lot of education, and that's where it has to start, is helping them understand this is how these pieces work. This is what this does. And here's how you can benefit from it. Here's the value to you, so that you can, we can take away this piece of operational burden that you might have today, you doing it this way, and then you can shift to focus on something else. But it starts with education and guidance.
Yeah. And then after the education and guidance is being proactive in helping with use case identification. And how do you find small, low barrier to entry, low risk projects that allow your team to get a taste for it, to try it out, to start to learn? I mean, labs are great, certifications are great, but what's best is being able to actually start tackling some projects. So what are some projects that you can do that involve public data? As an example, let's pull this in and we want to start looking at this. Okay, now we've got some derived data, or we've got some anonymized data that we can bring that in to join with this. And let's go ahead and now let's pretend that this data is PII. Let's start to lock this down. Let's make sure we run through the exercises. Do we feel like we've got a good grasp? And then by the time you're done with that, your team's saying, okay, think we understand it, think we know where we need to lock this data down, think we've got our automation points put together, think we've got our config manage put together, our vulnerability scannings are going well, we're doing our secret scans, our static code analysis, everything looks great. We can start to tackle something a little bit meatier, something a little bit scarier.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's one of the big pieces of advice I give, when people are going to DevOps in the cloud is find the smaller teams, find the smaller project to figure out what to do right and what works and what doesn't before you start tackling some of the larger ones, right? That totally makes sense. Let's shift for the last maybe 9 or 10 minutes over to compliance. So I think, at the very beginning, we talked about compliance being a big focus for healthcare companies, and maybe, one of the biggest challenges they have in the cloud is compliance and showing compliance. So one of the questions I guess that I have is, as your customers are going through compliance in the cloud, do you find challenges with the auditors maybe aren't cloud savvy? Some of them, do you find that they're getting more cloud savvy? I'm just curious, because to me, sometimes that's a challenge is when you bring an auditor and they may not have experience in the cloud, and then you're left trying to explain the cloud or explain what you're doing in the cloud. Like, is that still a thing? Or do we find that, anybody that comes in is familiar with the cloud and evidence gathering is easy?
Yeah, I can jump in here. Auditors definitely have a very challenging job. I work with many ex-auditors, and I can tell you, the biggest pain point they ever had was figuring out what evidence has been collected to prove your compliance. So companies can have a kind of a guided approach of, here, this is the list of evidence I need every quarter, every month, whichever cadence it may be. But I think getting to the auditor, the biggest problem there was chasing the individuals who are control owners, right? Hey, can you provide me evidence for the last quarter showing me that this is your access list, that individuals access that system? So what cloud has made it easier for is having that continuous control monitoring use case really be able to meet easily. So as you're collecting evidence to prove out your HIPAA compliance, PCI for credit card, whatever the case may be, the cloud tools are building auditor portals that they can leverage. They can easily see exactly what evidence has been collected, review it. Now, the auditing side of the house, their own control testing. Every auditor that we work with or talk to in past experience, they have their own tools. They just love what they do and how they do it. So getting them on board into a specific cloud-based tool that can help manage the compliance between the organization and the auditor, that's still a challenge today, but that's something we as a company also work on, making sure that we can also train the auditors on these new tools and new technologies and making their life a little bit easier.
Makes sense.
And one thing I'll to kind of expand on that. So Timmy asked if auditors were better understanding the cloud. As an example, there's an organization called ENAC, EHNAC, that was an auditor for healthcare data specifically. And for the longest time, they required as one of their controls a data center tour by the auditor. And in the cloud, that's extremely challenging. And so it took a long time, but they did in 2019 start adopting a cloud-enabled services program where you could utilize existing risk management programs from the cloud service providers, especially ones that aligned with FedRAMP, and then you would inherit those controls. And that removed the burden from a lot of these data center access requirements. So that's an example of a healthcare-specific organization that has moved to where the cloud is. And we're seeing more and more of that as folks move into the cloud. They understand it better. To Clay's point about the automation, the auditing, the controls, the continuous controls. They're really starting to look for those rather than send me a screenshot of XYZ.
Yeah, 6 years ago, it was a little bit of a struggle. We were going through a SOC 2 and a PCI certification at the same time because I hated my security team and set that up. They made it through, but yeah, I mean, there was the on-prem tours and everything that they were trying to push. And we're like, we don't have anything on-prem. Everything's cloud native. And like, right, but like on the office, on the Wi-Fi, like, right, but like you can't get to it without a VPN. Like it exists in Amazon land, and there's people with machine guns there that aren't going to let you in if you try to go show up. And eventually it took a little back and forth, and you had AWS artifacts, and like, look, here's their SOC 2, here's their HIPAA, right? Like they've got it all. Just kind of take that. And now with some of our clients, we've helped get other certifications. Like they're very cloud savvy, I would say these days. We don't get any kind of those weird like head scratching going, I don't actually know how to show you that because that's not a thing in my world. And it's been great. It's much, much smoother now.
Yeah, I'm with you. I felt that the industry has kind of shifted. I think a good example, I know HIPAA is undergoing kind of some new updates, and hopefully they'll do the same thing. But I know, like, just for SOC 2 as an example, like there's still a lot of healthcare companies that have to do SOC 2. And if you look at the ISO, that is still a common one. And the ISO revisions, that they just announced. I don't know if you guys have looked at the 2022, but they're very much more cloud savvy. Like they literally talk about threat intelligence. They talk about cloud security and making sure that you have something monitoring your cloud security. They talk about AppSec. I mean, I felt like they did a really good job of kind of going back, because obviously I think the last revision was back in 2013, I think, or something like that, before this year. And so hopefully, like I've seen some of the auditors kind of make that transition, and hopefully, like like HIPAA and some of the other ones will make that as well. Because I'm with you, like that used to be a pain for me, and even when I was doing contract reviews, some customers would have it written in the contracts if they want to be able to do a data center tour, and I'm like, you can show up at AWS if you want to and ask for a tour, but I'm not sure that they're gonna let you in as a part of our contract. So after all that, just kind of, this may be a little bit of opinion, but like, do you find that the cloud makes adherence to compliance regulations easier, harder, indifferent, just a different way of doing it? What's kind of your opinion?
My opinion is it makes it easier. It can make it easier. You do have to plan ahead, and there's some education there. But it can be easier. So we've talked a lot about automation and infrastructure as code. These are, again, I'll use the foundation analogy. These are foundations you build that you can expand on, and they will help you enforce those controls at scale. And there's so much automation and controls you can put into place that allow you to build and change and run a system or a workload and always ensure those controls are in place. We talked about S3 and public access. There's controls, a check of a box, and you can make sure that any bucket can't be public. You can monitor it through tools like AWS Config. You can actually enforce it so that when a new bucket's created, it's monitored, and if it's unencrypted, you can remediate it. Or you can use things like a service catalog that allows you to deploy approved templates so that your developers, your infrastructure folks, they can deploy things with the controls baked in. And those are the ways to make life easier. And then you can also, those same tools, they can actually help you collect and prove your compliance posture, because you can showcase, hey, this is how we declared it, this is how it's deployed, and here's proof that it's deployed using these controls. And again, that's done at scale. So you don't need to screenshot all of your buckets. You can show the process and the and proof that that's how it's happening. And in the past, you'd have to deploy one server at a time, go and install antivirus on that server, prove that it's on there. Where are the audit logs kept? You have to go track down so many things. And the cloud helps you kind of centralize all that.
Yeah, it goes back to the automation that was mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Sorry, Play. Go ahead, Play.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback off of Connor here. Compliance itself is, it's sad to say, but I think it's always going to be a complex process for individuals and organizations. But I think the technology out there, we all three here come from different parts of the technology, from cloud security to compliance to audit portals. There's all of that out there to help simplify compliance, giving an organization that guidance, that secure way to manage and build that foundation. So I think compliance, again, to summarize, it may be complex for some time, but there's tool and technology out there to help organizations.
I mean, the shared responsibility model, right? That takes almost half of the process away. And so then if you just focus on building out the automation, like Connor talked about, the job is far easier. And I think the cloud companies do help a lot with that, because you don't have to worry about the underlying hardware, the provisioning, the security of the sites, any of that stuff. You're now, which is good and great, because you have less brute force attacks, right? Like the attackers these days are much more savvy. They're going to try to come in through application vulnerabilities, through people vulnerabilities, right? And so I think that focuses the security team as well on working on the right things to be locking down. And then when you throw the compliance with that, it helps give you that guidance of what should you be making sure you have checked, right? Yes, compliance is kind of obnoxious, but hand in hand, it helps your cloud security posture so much because you know that you've checked those other things. And then, as you mentioned with the ISO updates, right? Like it's great that you're seeing AppSec become a major focus, right? Like that's the direction that should be happening.